Imagine peaking in high school, not regular peaking. We're talking 3 continents, captain of every team voted most likely to run the world peaking. Now imagine spending the next 200 years slowly, publicly, agonizingly, watching everyone else grow up while you keep peaking harder on memories. That's the Ottoman Empire, and somehow it gets worse because nobody in this story has the decency to just let it end quickly. At its absolute best, the Ottoman Empire ran a chunk of the planet stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf and somehow held it together for 600 years using one extremely confident family business. And think of it less as a government and more as the world's most successful, longest running, mildly terrifying family restaurant instead of a secret sauce. The secret was elite soldiers, ruthless administration, and a habit of besieging anyone who looked at them funny. Suleiman I ran the place in the 1500s and did so well, they nicknamed him the Magnificent, which is the kind of nickname you only get if absolutely nobody dares disagree. Here's the part nobody tells you. The Ottomans didn't lose this empire in one big dramatic battle, the kind where a guy on a horse yells something inspiring right before everybody dies nobly. That would at least be efficient. No, this empire died slowly over roughly 2 centuries, which is the geopolitical equivalent of a Wi-Fi connection that keeps saying reconnecting right as you're about to win the argument. After Suleiman, things got weird fast. A run of sultans came along who were, to put it generously, not built for the family business. Some were children. Some were locked in a palace compound for most of their lives, and then suddenly handed an empire, which is a bit like never being allowed to drive and then getting handed the keys to a continent. Power quietly shifted to mothers, advisors, and the empire's elite soldiers, the Janissaries, who had started out as the most disciplined fighting force in Europe and slowly evolved into something closer to a hereditary union that occasionally murdered sultans it didn't like. Reform at this point was less a policy and more a threat to somebody's pension. Meanwhile, Europe kept doing something deeply rude, improving new weapons, new trade routes, new ways of organizing economies that didn't depend entirely on conquest. The Ottomans, for their part, kept doing what worked in 1520 because if it's not broken, why fix it? It was extremely broken. They just hadn't checked the group chat in a while. Picture Europe's major powers as one long-running group chat. Everybody's in it. Austria, Russia, Britain, France, constantly messaging about borders, marriages, and whose cousin gets which throne this week. For a long time, the Ottomans weren't even in the chat because they were too busy being terrifying. But by the 1700s, the chat starts noticing something. The empire keeps losing wars, losing territory, losing the ability to collect taxes from half its own provinces. Someone in the chat, generally credited to Tsar Nicholas I, though honestly it could have been a group effort, finally types the quiet part out loud. The sick man of Europe. And just like that, the empire gets the one label every empire dreads, not enemy, not threat, patient. You'd think being formally diagnosed as the sick man of an entire continent would inspire some changes, and to be fair, there were attempts. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-1800s tried to modernize the legal system, the military, even citizenship itself, the political equivalent of buying a gym membership in January with genuinely good intentions. The problem is that fixing 600 years of institutional habits is a bit like renovating a house while several rooms are actively on fire and the contractor keeps getting replaced by his own jealous brother. Reform attempts kept getting strangled by entrenched elites, palace politics, and a bureaucracy whose entire personality was, "We've always done it this way," which again was extremely broken. Meanwhile, the empire's finances were doing what a hospital patient's finances do when nobody checks the chart, getting worse fast. The Ottomans borrowed heavily from European banks to fund wars and a lifestyle they could no longer afford. Eventually, they couldn't pay it back, so European creditors essentially said, "That's fine, we'll just run your treasury for you," and created something genuinely called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, staffed largely by foreigners with actual legal authority to collect Ottoman taxes and revenue directly. Imagine missing a few credit card payments and waking up to find a stranger in your kitchen, calmly going through your mail because technically he's allowed to now. That's basically what happened to an entire empire's economy. The chat had stopped just gossiping about the sick man. They'd started managing his finances. And here's where the joke turns from funny to genuinely sad. Because while all this was happening, the empire's territories, full of actual people with actual identities, started asking a very reasonable 19th century question. Why exactly are we still part of this? Nationalism swept through the Balkans like the world's least fun trend. Greece broke away first after a brutal war of independence, then Serbia, then Romania, then Bulgaria. One by one, provinces left the chat, sometimes through treaties, often through revolt and brutal crackdowns that cost an enormous number of lives. This video finds plenty of comedy in incompetence at the top. It does not find any comedy in the people who paid for it. By 1908, a group of reform-minded military officers, calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, had basically had enough of waiting for the Sultan to fix things and force their way into power, eventually narrowing down to 3 men running the empire's actual decisions. 3 guys, total control, no real checks on their power. Extremely normal. Nothing about that ever goes wrong. They modernized plenty, but they also leaned hard into nationalism at a moment when the empire was made up of dozens of ethnic groups who'd just spent a century watching their neighbors successfully leave the chat. Then in 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars happened, and the empire lost nearly all of its remaining European territory in about 18 months. The sick man hadn't just gotten worse. He'd been discharged from most of his own house. And then, because nothing in this story is allowed to stay merely bad, the empire made one final era-defining mistake: World War I. If you're picking a side in the biggest, bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen, you'd hope an empire desperate to prove it still mattered would choose carefully. Instead, the Ottomans allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the 2 powers least likely to win a long war of attrition, against an alliance that included Britain, France, and Russia's bottomless well of soldiers. It's the geopolitical equivalent of joining a group project with the 2 classmates who never do the reading right before the professor announces it's worth 50% of the grade. To be fair, there was one genuine bright spot. The Ottomans won a major hard-fought defensive victory at Gallipoli, beating back a massive Allied invasion, and it remains one of the few moments the empire's army performed brilliantly. One good performance, though, does not save the rest of the show. The war years also produced one of the darkest chapters in this entire story, and it deserves to be said plainly without a joke anywhere near it. Starting in 1915, the Ottoman government carried out the systematic deportation and mass killing of its Armenian population, an atrocity recognized by most historians and many governments today as genocide, with death toll estimates commonly placed between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. Whatever comedy exists in this video belongs to the failures of empires and the egos of leaders. None of it belongs to the people who suffered because of them. By 1918, the war was lost and the empire was occupied. The chat, now mostly the victorious Allied powers, finally got to do the thing it had apparently been wanting to do for a century: carve the whole thing up. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was less a peace treaty and more an eviction notice, with extremely detailed floor plans, stripping away Ottoman territory across the Middle East and chunks of Anatolia itself, leaving what remained barely able to call itself a state. If the sick man of Europe had been on life support for 100 years, Sèvres was the family gathering around the bed to discuss the will out loud in front of him. Here's the plot twist nobody in that chat saw coming. A Turkish military officer named Mustafa Kemal, who had actually been one of the commanders behind that one good moment at Gallipoli, looked at the treaty, looked at the partition maps, and said, with what historians might generously describe as enormous confidence, absolutely not. He organized a national resistance movement, fought a genuine war of independence against occupying and invading forces, and won. By 1923, the Treaty of Sèvres was scrapped entirely, replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognized a new, independent, internationally acknowledged state, the Republic of Turkey. Kemal, later given the name Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, abolished the 600-year-old sultanate, then the caliphate that came with it, and built a secular republic, essentially from scratch. The empire that took 6 centuries to build and 2 centuries to die finally got its actual official funeral, handled not by the great powers who'd been gossiping about it for generations, but by one of its own former generals who simply refused to let foreigners write the obituary. The consequences didn't stay neatly in the past either. Much of the modern Middle East's borders, including Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, were drawn up in the chaos of the empire's final collapse, carved out under British and French mandates, with roughly the long-term planning you'd expect from 2 people splitting a pizza they don't actually like. A lot of the regional tension people casually wave off today as it's complicated traces directly back to lines drawn by outsiders, finishing off an empire they'd spent a century diagnosing instead of actually understanding. So whatever happened to the most popular kid in the empire's high school yearbook, he didn't go out in one big dramatic battle. He went out the way most former popular kids do, slowly, awkwardly, getting quietly removed from group chats he used to run, watching the cool new kids he used to terrify build their own countries out of his old bedroom, until one former classmate walked in, told everyone else to leave, and started over without asking permission. 600 years reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when you keep replying, "We're fine," to an intervention everyone else can clearly see you need. Turns out the sickest part of being the sick man of Europe was never the diagnosis. It was getting removed from the chat before he'd even finished reading the messages.